Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Tapping into the Hidden Consumer Demand for Sustainability. I'm Abby Lundberg, Editor-in-Chief at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be moderating the event. It's a fair bet to say that you and the audience care about sustainability, or you wouldn't be spending this hour with us. And I'm sure your concerns about sustainability influence the decisions you make as a consumer as well. But how often have you found yourself in a grocery store aisle wondering whether to choose the more sustainable product or the less expensive one? Have you ever booked a flight for a vacation and been given the option to pay a premium to offset the carbon generated by your air travel? These are not easy choices, and it turns out they may be based in fundamentally flawed assumptions on the part of the companies marketing sustainable options. That's because many companies misunderstand how consumers weigh sustainability in their purchasing decisions. Here to tell us more about that and how companies can do a better job of marketing sustainable products to consumers is Nikolai Broby Eckert, Senior Partner and Co-Head of the Nordics at Simon Kucher in Copenhagen. For more than 20 years, Nikolai has worked with some of the largest companies in the Nordics on corporate and commercial strategy. He's also a passionate angel investor. His colleague, Caroline Kashtenberg, had a family emergency and won't be able to join us today. We wish her all the best. Along with Andreas van der Gaten, Nikolai and Caroline are the co-authors of the new book, The Demand Revolution: How Consumers Are Redefining Sustainability and Transforming the Future of Business, out next week from MIT Press, and we'll be running a related article in our winter issue. Welcome, Nikolai.
Good. So I will jump into the presentation. It's great to see you all here for this webinar. I've really looked forward to sharing some of the insights we've spent the last 3 years on, really analyzing in depth how consumers think about sustainability and the strategic consequences that has for companies that want to capitalize on this rather big consumer megatrend. So let me get started by going through the 4 main sections of the book that we've authored. So the first section of the book talks about this fatal disconnect that Abby also mentioned in her introduction. So what we found out during our research is that a lot of companies are struggling with how to commercialize sustainability and make a profit from sustainability. And a lot of them are also questioning whether consumers are really interested in sustainability if they do not want to pay a premium, which for many companies, if you want to be sustainable, you need to charge a premium to cover your costs. And that's one of the main reasons that we wanted to tackle that area in the book. The second area of the book and the second section is moving into why we believe this is a different megatrend than other megatrends that you've typically seen, such as the technology-driven megatrends of digitalization and other areas. We believe this is one of the first consumer-driven transformative megatrends, and that has a number of strategic consequences that we go through in the book, and I'll also present during today's webinar. The third section of the book is about the consumer's call for action. Here we've segmented the consumers into different segments on how they think about sustainability, and it's a segmentation model that we don't think has been presented before, and hopefully you will find this interesting in terms of the different behaviors we see. And lastly, the last section of the book is about the growth imperative. So how can companies, based on those 3 first sections, adjust their commercial strategies and their sustainability strategies in order to tap into this massive market or consumer movement. So I'm really looking forward to presenting these different sections of the book and look forward to your questions afterwards. If we look to the first area, so the fatal disconnect, you could say historically there are 2 strategies that companies have applied in order to go to market with sustainable products. The first one is what we call a premium price strategy or a skimming strategy, where they have looked at, okay, let's launch sustainable product lines. And of course, that has an added cost. How do we cover that cost? By adding that price to the end consumer. And that was extremely successful when you were targeting a rather small consumer segment, what we call the green champions. The problem with that strategy currently is sustainability has moved from the fringes of smaller segments to being a mass consumer movement, and consumers cannot afford a premiumization on their daily lives. we already know that during inflation crisis we had in the last few years, we've talked about a cost of living crisis, and that's been maybe an inflation of 3 to 6%, depending on what region you're in. But for many sustainable solutions, we're talking premiums of 10, 20, 30% on standard purchases. And a lot of consumers simply cannot afford that kind of premium. So the second area that companies have focused on is what we call the quality penalty. So they've launched sustainable products, but they were inferior in other areas. They might be poorly designed, have worse quality or other areas. So basically the consumers needed to sacrifice convenience or design or other areas in order to get a green product or sustainable product. Again, this was a successful strategy when you're targeting what we call the planet savers, the ones that were deeply committed to sustainability and were also willing to sacrifice other attributes. But again, when sustainability is moving into mass market, the challenge is that most consumers are not willing to sacrifice on design, quality, and other aspects. So they're looking for, you could say, scalable, sustainable solutions at an affordable price point, which is why these two strategies are failing. So in a lot of the CEOs we interviewed as part of this book, were questioning whether it was worth investing in sustainability now they couldn't charge a premium. But what we're saying in this book is you need to look much more at the growth potential that is within a sustainable solution. We also identified 5 other failure modes, and that I'm sure that you've experienced some of these as consumers. One of them is it's only about the messaging, which very much focuses on these bold statements, which often had a negative impact on consumers. And the reason for that is once consumers decide they want to buy a sustainable offering, they actually spend much more time looking into what's the right product and brand for that solution. So bold statements that aren't true are very, very difficult to launch when you're looking at sustainable solutions. The other area is talking gibberish to consumers. So we just talked about adding, green fuel on an airline ticket, and we've seen examples where consumers have been offered that option 30 minutes before takeoff. And of course, consumers quickly realize they're not going to put more green fuel on the plane just because I pay a premium for green fuel 30 minutes before takeoff. So this is another example of trying to launch this, but really doing it in a very poor way. Also, a strategy a lot of companies use is to niche their way to success, to say we launch a green product line, and then hopefully we succeed with selling that to consumers. Again, consumers are looking at the entire company and brand, whether they're actually green and sustainable, and therefore that's very unlikely to succeed as well. And then we have 2 last failure modes, which is looking to win the compliance game or playing the waiting game. Both of those are very dangerous when it comes to a consumer-driven megatrend, and I'll get more into that as we move on with the presentation. So what does this mean? Well, this actually means that when we're looking at the data, we can see that 78% of consumers have sustainability as a top 5 purchasing criteria in at least one product category. And that means when you look at the normal classical adoption curve, consumers are actually higher up than a lot of companies perceive them right now. And that's what we in the book call the perception gap. And the challenge with this is that a lot of companies are not really seeing that potential volume uplift because they're launching products that are too expensive or not really available to consumers. And this perception gap also means there's a huge opportunity for companies if they can meet this gap with available, affordable green products. So in the lack of, you could say, affordable green solutions, what do consumers do? Well, they do lots of other things in order to meet their desire for a sustainable solution. One of them is they shift from maybe more volume-based purchases to more quality-based purchases, so buying products and services that last longer. What we're also seeing is a lot of consumers are shifting to second-hand or thrifting in order to fulfill their sustainable product needs when they can't find affordable solutions. They're also moving to other megatrends such as the sharing economy, which to a large degree also supports sustainability because we're sharing resources. So there are many of these consumer trends that are by a lot of companies considered other trends that are actually correlated with the sustainability trends and therefore really impacting the way consumers act in terms of buying products and solutions. Good. So that was kind of the fast introduction to the first section of the book. If we move into the second section of the book, it's really about what does this mean in terms of consumers? Well, as I mentioned before, some 78% of consumers that we've interviewed over the last 3 years in North America and Europe say that they have sustainability in a top 5 purchasing criteria in at least one product category. When we look more deeply, 32% had it as the primary purchasing criteria in at least one product category. And we see this movement over time where it's more and more product categories and it's more and more important in terms of purchasing criteria. Now, for the people on the call that worked with, attributes, purchasing attributes, at least for me, that's worked 20 years with this is the biggest move I've seen in terms of consumer preference in the last 20 years. This is really a mass movement when you see new attributes coming in on par with price, quality, and brand. So this really shows the importance of sustainability in consumer lives today. What we've also noticed as part of our studies for the book was that consumers act very, very, very different when they're looking to make a green purchase in a product category, which is very interesting for companies. The first thing is they're willing to spend significantly more time researching the brands and the products and how sustainable they are. This is a gift for a lot of companies because normally it's very difficult to get through the mass communication in terms of marketing. But here consumers are actually interested in finding out more about how sustainable companies are. Secondly, they're much more willing to shift brands, even past when they're 40. They're willing to shift brands in order to find a sustainable solution. Also something you haven't seen before. And the third area is they are significantly much more loyal once they've chosen a brand or a product they find is sustainable. And the reason for that is they don't want to spend that time again. Consumers don't have time to spend that degree of time in researching products and services every time they make a purchase. So once they've found a supplier that they believe is more sustainable, they will be loyal to that brand. And that also has a huge value for the companies that target this segment of consumers. And also, they're significantly more willing to advocate for these brands because they're not advocating a brand, they're advocating a personal choice. And why is this interesting for companies? Well, what I think is really interesting is this means that the lifetime value of sustainable consumers are much higher than it is during normal purchases. And that also means that a strategy focused on charging a premium short term to make an extra profit is much less desirable than tapping into this long-term consumer value. So what does this change in consumer behavior mean? Well, we've tried to set up what we call the demand-driven megatrend versus a classical technology-driven megatrend. So we all know the adoption curves of normal megatrends, where you typically have a slow adoption of new offerings. You have early adopters, where you can charge that have a much higher willingness to pay, and where you can charge a premium. So typically, it's low volume and high price. Second mover strategy is very advantageous for, you could say, incumbent players because they can have the younger companies make the mistakes and they move in once it moves to mass market. And competitors can normally copy technology quite quickly. Copying an iPhone is much easier than reinventing your entire ecosystem or business model. And that's how it's very different when it comes to the consumer-driven megatrend of sustainability. So first of all, there's a rapid adoption and uptake if you bring the right offering to market with an affordable price point. And we've all seen it when it comes to electric cars and solar energy, that the adoption curves are much more aggressive than a lot of people thought initially. Secondly, there is a limited added willingness to pay. This does not mean that there isn't an opportunity to charge a premium for a certain period, but the major strategy should be tapping into this major volume potential in terms of consumers. Thirdly, the second mover strategy is much more risky because when you've had this untapped market potential, you tap into this hidden demand. It's much more difficult to get a major market share later on. Secondly, it's much more difficult to redesign your value chain or ecosystem, which is what you need to do if you really want to bring sustainable products to market at scale. It typically means you need to redesign your business model and maybe even your extended ecosystem. And that can take 5 to 10 years. So that's not a 2-year copying of another competitor's products. And that's why we think strategically that sustainability is a very, very different megatrend where you need to adopt a different strategic playbook than historic megatrends. Could you switch to the next slide, please? Thank you. And here's an example of this. So if you look at the EV adoption, and here you have a study by a consulting firm that in 18, 20, 21, and 22 had different versions of how quickly you would see the market uptake. And this is a very good example of how the adoption rate was much faster than a lot of research institutions, consulting companies, and companies thought, because you have this pent-up consumer demand that is instantly opened up once you find that affordable price point, which leads to an accelerated adoption and, of course, massive strategic opportunity for the companies that manage to bring sustainable products and services to market at an affordable price point. Good. Let's talk a little bit about the consumers and how they act in terms of sustainability. So as part of the work for the book, we interviewed tens of thousands of consumers in order to understand their thinking around sustainability and how they acted. And one of the main things we looked into was their sustainability commitment and their willingness to pay. But the way we looked into it was, in how many categories is sustainability a top 5 purchasing criteria for consumers? So if you look at the model, the segments to the right, they have many or all segments. Sustainability is a top 5 purchasing criteria. And to the left side, the consumer segments only have 1 or 2 product categories where it's a top 5 purchasing criteria. So that's the scale for sustainability commitment. On the other axis, you have willingness to pay, but that's not in regards to how much more you were willing to pay, but in how many categories you're willing to pay more as a consumer. And what was really interesting when we did this analysis was it's actually only 15% of European and North American consumers that don't believe in sustainability, that aren't interested. So it's not a priority in terms of commitment. It's not a high percentage in terms of attributes, and they're not willing to pay for it. 85% of consumers in at least 1 or more categories have sustainability as a main purchasing criteria. And that also led to these archetypes that we describe in the book. And of course, everybody will recognize what I call the champions and the non-believers. So as I said before, 15% are non-believers. That doesn't mean that they aren't interested in reducing waste and other things. It's just not important in terms of purchasing criteria, and they're definitely not willing to pay for it. If you look at the champions, which are the other end of the extreme, which is about 8% of North American and European consumers, it's always a top 5 purchasing criteria, sometimes even a top 2 or top 3 purchasing criteria. And in almost all categories, they're willing to pay more for sustainability. And then you have the rest of the segments. So you have the image-driven, which really aspire to live sustainable lives, and they give a greater weight to sustainability, but only in categories that kind of affect their image. So they're typically the brand buyers. That's very important that they, can talk about the brands they buy and the purchases they're making. And when they're buying sustainably, it's really, really about, that personal image. Then you at the bottom left, you have the skeptics. So the skeptics aren't skeptical about the sustainability and the need to make a change. They're actually skeptical about whether they can make a difference and whether they can trust the companies that are making sustainability claims. So here it's really about trust and convincing them about the difference they can make on a daily basis if we want to move them towards the right in the model. Then we have the cost conscious. Again, they prioritize sustainability in many categories, but they simply cannot afford it. So here, affordability is really important, more than in many other segments. And then on the right-hand side, bottom, you have the planet savers. So these are the ones that we've known for many years. Planet savers are so dedicated that, they will probably not buy an electric car. Instead, they'll take a bike. They'll take trains when they travel or not travel at all. Or they'll buy used or thrifting because they know that's better for the environment than buying new products and new services. So they're really at the extreme of the spectrum. And then you have the selectives and the thoughtfuls. So the selective typically have a number of product categories where they say, yeah, I really want an electric car, or I want to get groceries that are good for the environment and good for my body, but I'm not gonna buy a sustainable flight or offset my airline ticket because I deserve to go on a good vacation, and that's the area where I'm not going to be sustainable in that category. So they really select where they want to be sustainable and where not. And then you have the thoughtfuls. So they're probably the most analytical segment in our model, and they typically look very much into the how sustainable products and services are, calculate the impact and the cost, and they think lifetime cost when they're looking at buying sustainable products. So those are the segments that we've developed for the book, and we've gotten a lot of interesting feedback on those segments from our readers and clients. And what I'd like to do now is start a little poll and hear, what segment do you think you belong to? So could we start the poll, please? Excellent. So I know this will take a bigger time, and of course the normal question is, what segment do you think you belong to as an author? And we had a lot of discussions about that as authors. I very much think I belong to the thoughtful, maybe partly image-driven segment. I bought a Tesla about 2015, have really analyzed a lot and looked into this as part of also being more and more interested in this area. My co-author Caroline sees herself more as a selective, and so does Andreas, my other co-author. Very interesting to see the results. So we have a lot of thoughtfuls and a lot of selectives. Interesting. I think this is a great exercise for you to run also in your own companies around how does this fit also with your consumer segments you're targeting today, because that has, of course, a huge impact on what kind of sustainability strategies you should adopt. But very, very interesting. So I think we have about 33% thoughtful and some 27% selective. So that's a bit different than the survey overall, but of course, I'm pretty sure that the participants in this call today are also have a large interest in this area naturally. Good. Let's move over to the presentation again. Good. Now let's talk a little bit about the growth imperative. So how should companies act based on the knowledge we gained as part of writing this book? And I think one of the first things I'd like to talk about is, when a megatrend hits, and sustainability is by no means a new megatrend, it's been around for a long time, but we do believe it's about to hit a pivotal point. And in certain industries, it certainly is. But it typically incumbents, they're not surprised by megatrends. They know this megatrend is coming. And the case that a lot of us know from business schools, of course, is the case of Kodak and digital film. And it wasn't the case that Kodak didn't know that this was the future, and they actually invented the digital film. I think the challenge for Kodak was, how do we dismantle one of the most profitable ecosystems in the industry while we start earning money from this new trend, which is digital film? And that was the big challenge. And very few business schools actually teach you that. And I think it's very much going to be the same with sustainability. And it's even going to be more, you could say, aggressive, because as I mentioned before, in order to deliver sustainable products at an affordable price point to consumers, you need to do your fair amount of creative destruction or business model destruction, and even commercial creativity. So as an example, you might need to completely reinvent how you do business today. If you talk about electric cars, we all know electric cars have much less service, which is the major income for most automotive companies, which means you now need to earn your money in selling the cars and less on service. And that is, of course, naturally a very big change in the business model. Secondly, when it comes to commercial creativity, that is also a way of increasing affordability. So one of the good examples of this is if you take home storage batteries. So naturally, home storage is still expensive in many countries, but Onan and others have launched home batteries that you can connect to the grid in terms of selling and functioning as a backup power to the grid. So when there's grid failure, they can access your home battery and use that extra power to support the grid. Naturally, they pay a lot of money for that. And that, of course, doesn't decrease the cost of the battery, but it makes it a lot more affordable because now you have a secondary income stream. And that's an example of commercial creativity as a way of bringing affordability about when it comes to sustainable products. And there are, of course, many other examples of this. So what does this mean? Well, we believe that this means that you need to adopt an entirely new innovation paradigm. You need to look way beyond products and offerings. You need to look at your business model and ecosystem, and sometimes even the extended ecosystem. So a lot of industries are in a situation where it's probably not something you can do on your own. You need to do it as an entire industry, such as fashion or other areas. And that means that you need to take a key role together with your industry in bringing down the cost of sustainable offerings. And naturally, the companies that do this very well will bring about sustainable products at an affordable price point that will be very, very difficult for competitors to copy. What we also did in the book is try to translate these different trends into what kind of strategies or strategic plays can you then adopt as a company. So we identified 6 plays. There, of course, might be other plays you can adopt, and they're not mutually exclusive. So you can definitely, as a company, do several of these plays at the same time. So we identify a longevity play, a brand play, a mass affordability play, an anti-waste play, an ease of choice play, and an engagement play. In the book, we have case examples of each of these plays, but I wanted to go through the first play with you now because it's a very, very interesting case. So the case of Fnac Darty, for many of you, you probably don't know this company. It's a French wholesaler that are selling white goods. But they started as a service organization. So they were servicing white goods across France and Europe. And they found out at a certain point that there was a huge discrepancy between the claims that companies were making, so white goods manufacturers, and the actual ability to extend the life of these products. So they actually started using the data and then creating a repairability index. And once they'd done that, they started launching that on their homepage, but also in their stores. So they started showing consumers what are the 3 most easiest products to repair. What's the repairability grade of products in each category. And what was really interesting is the first thing that happened naturally was the products that were classified as in the top 3 were receiving significant boost in volume because consumers really wanted repairable products. They don't want to throw away a fridge just because there's a minor mistake with it. So that was really interesting to see. But the second thing they did was launch a subscription model based on this, where they said, listen, for a number of euros a month, we'll give you lifetime guarantee of this product. We'll give you lifetime repairs free of charge. And today they have more than 1 million subscribers on that plan. And this is a very, very good example of a longevity strategy where the strategy is to increase the lifetime of the products. And we all know that for consumers, this is a very, very easy way of indicating the sustainability of a product. If it lasts twice as long, the CO2 footprint is half of buying a normal product. So a very successful strategy where they've utilized an existing strategic advantage to really power through in terms of sustainability and build a brand in this area. So a very interesting case that I really would recommend that you look into. And then we get to one of my last slides, which is, of course, in each industry, there's a different speed of change. As we mentioned before, there are industries where this is an ecosystem change, and that means it's going to take longer than other industries. So naturally, as a company, you need to understand what is the degree of change needed in my industry in order to bring sustainable products to market at an affordable price point. So if you're a wholesaler, you don't need to reinvent your business model. There, it's more about the products you sell. But of course, if you're an automotive company, then you're in the middle of what I call the death zone right now. So the degree of change is rather significant and the speed of change is rather fast. And naturally, as a company, you need to understand which of these zones are in, because that's, of course, going to decide how quickly you need to act as a leadership team around these topics. And of course, you need to say, so how strong is the consumer pull in each of these industries? how quickly is your industry's ecosystem evolving or moving towards meeting these needs? And how ready are you to execute the necessary changes needed in order to bring about sustainable products at an affordable price point? So those are key questions that you need to ask as a company in order to succeed with this transition. And what we really believe is that there is a pivot point out there. And of course, it's very difficult to say when that will be. But we believe that if you cannot produce sustainable products profitably at an affordable price point, at the time where you could say the two different paths of products meet, which means you could say the CO2-based products and the sustainable products, then you will have a very hard time surviving this change. There will be this pivot point, and I think we're already at that pivot point, both in terms of energy manufacturing and solar cells and electric cars at the moment, and I'm pretty sure we'll meet other pivot points in other industries as we move along in the next couple of years. So this is very important to understand. How quickly will that pivot point come about, and how do we act as a company in order to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where this ends up killing our business? So I just wanted to end up with saying that I will be doing a US book tour very soon, joining some different conferences in San Diego, Las Vegas, and San Jose. So if any of you are listening in from the US, please ping me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to meet up and discuss the conclusions and findings in the book. So very much look forward to that. Please just reach out, and I look forward to having those discussions. Secondly, if you have a further interest in this, naturally, you can pre-order the book on Amazon. There's a QR code here. And we also have a sustainability newsletter through my LinkedIn page that we launch every 2 weeks, where we deep dive into cases and more content that isn't in the book in order to elaborate even more on these different conclusions we have. And then, of course, we also have a webpage dedicated to the book where you can read more about the book and us as authors. So feel free to look into this and sign up if it has an interest.
Great. Thank you, Nikolai. And I'm going to channel Malika, who said super interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Just, it's such a different way of thinking about how companies approach sustainability and makes so much sense. And I'm so glad you used the DART example, because one of my first questions was going to be, it's really a challenge for consumer product companies when they have consumers who are very cost conscious. They want products that last longer, they're thrifting, they're sharing. And so I was thinking, well, do the companies just ignore those consumers? But you've given us at least one example, and I know there are more in the book, to say you can still reach those consumers. So that's super interesting there. We're getting some questions in now from the audience, and one of the first questions that people had before you got into your segmentation of customers was, are there product categories that are highest priority for consumers in sustainability? Can you talk, and I know that you look at it kind of in a different way, so maybe if you could talk about it from, in general, but then for some of the specific consumer categories.
No, absolutely. I think it's a great question. And in the book, we actually have the full data, so you can actually see what segments or what product categories consumers are most interested in. And the interesting finding here was, so where most consumers find sustainability as kind of a top purchasing criteria, that has to do with personal health and well-being. So in terms of food, in terms of beauty products, that's also been a trend for a long time, that we want to use products in our body that's good for our body. And of course, that's linked to sustainability. It might be a proxy in some cases, but that is definitely important to a lot of consumers. So that's one of the most important categories. And then, of course, we move over to energy, home renovation, and other areas. But in the book, there's a full segmentation of product categories and how important it is across consumer segments.
Great. We have a couple of questions about how does this play out in the B2B world? Do the same kinds of things apply, or do you think about those segments differently?
No, so I mean, in the end, you could say that any B2B company usually sells to a B2C company that has these end consumers. And of course, a lot of conversations I'm having with B2B companies is, as you said, what's the consequence for us? So I recently worked with a big aluminum producer. So let me give you that example, which are pretty far back in the value chain, and they wanted to launch green aluminum across all their segments. But what we found out was that the customers they had that were most interested in sustainability as a strategic differentiator. So let's use the high-end automotive companies, for example. They know they can build this into their brand, and being sustainable can be part of the overall brand, and they can cover the cost because they have the brand. So they will go after the image-driven consumers, you could say. So we changed their strategy and said you should focus on making partnerships with those consumer companies that had that as a target group, so that we're targeting the right end consumers, because they had a significantly higher willingness to pay, at least for now. I also had other B2B companies that are even further back, so such as fertilizers, where when I presented the book to the leadership team, they said, this is really, really interesting. But that also means that in the end, we will not be able to charge a premium to PepsiCo or Coca-Cola when we produce fertilizers. So we actually need to go in and look at our ecosystem, and we need to lead that change in our ecosystem if this is true. And I think that's a very, very important conclusion based out of the book.
One other question regarding B2B businesses was from Maria. What are your thoughts on using regulation as a way to win in this space?
Yes. So of course, regulation is important. And actually what was interesting in our consumer studies was that it was different in what areas of the world we were in. So we did it in North America and Europe. If you looked at Northern Europe and my own home country, Denmark, the consumers were much more likely to say, well, we have a role, but politicians have an even bigger role. In Southern Europe, it was more personal choice. And in the US, it was kind of companies and personal choice in terms of who should make this change. I think in terms of bringing about change and the role politicians have is, as long as the extra income that comes from putting levies on you could say oil production or other areas goes into supporting the green transition, then it's okay. But if it's just making products more expensive, it's going to slow down the transition even more, because the problem is affordability. So unless that money is used to make green products more affordable, it's going to slow down the transition.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There are a number of questions about specific industries, so I'll mention a few of them and see what you think. So Carmen and Flynn were both interested in the large fashion and apparel industry, especially fast fashion. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So this, of course, is an area where you see rather significant growth, as you said, in thrifting or secondhand clothing. And I think what's interesting there, so we are also in the book, we talked to a CEO of a fast fashion company called Gianni, and they have a very sustainable approach, but also said, listen, we can't do this on our own. If we want to be sustainable, then we need to have the entire industry with us. But what was really interesting, what they noted is, we really want to do secondhand clothing. We want to bring back, and our customers can bring back secondhand clothing, and we can sell it for them, but we can't make a profit out of it. And when we had that discussion, it was really about, well, have you really thought through your business model? Because what he wanted to do was basically put secondhand clothing in existing stores with existing staff and cost levels. And of course, that doesn't make a profit because the costs are too high. But if you look at the really successful thrifting stores, the consumers are themselves putting tags on the clothes, taking pictures, putting them online, and maybe paying a fixed fee per month for having their clothes sold in that store. And that's what I mean with really rethinking your business model and ecosystem and your commercial creativity. You need to think of ways of doing it so it's profitable, because otherwise we'll never succeed with this transition.
Yeah, just really different way of thinking about this. So another couple of industries people were interested in. One was so Raju asks, how does one balance the challenges of delivering sustainability and affordable value in the food sector where there's such high inflation?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have the answer. But again, here I think it's really about rethinking this, and I think for a lot of industries, it's actually an opportunity to start over. So I don't think any consumers have an interest in buying food that's 6 or 8 or 10 weeks old in a supermarket. The reason that food lasts a long time is because it's good for the supermarkets, not for the consumers. And I think you really need to rethink the business model. And I know this is not easy and I don't have the answer. But of course, if you say, what do consumers really want and how do we deliver that to consumers? And I think a lot of industries have a lot of heritage that is actually not in the consumer interest and a lot of costs. You could say the same about cars, right? So I don't think consumers have an interest in spending thousands of dollars a year on spare parts and repairing cars. It's much nicer to have an electric car that doesn't break down as often. And I don't think people like fueling up the cars all the time. It's nice if you could just fuel it up at home through an electric outlet. So there's a lot of industries that have inherent disadvantages models that were based on an industry structure. And that's why we're saying you need to really rethink this. And we're not saying it's easy. This is very complex. But if you succeed, then I'm pretty sure you will tap into this large potential that exists with consumers.
Great. One more industry question. Did you notice a different consumer behavior for medical devices category? This product category is limited by strict regulations, insurances, et cetera.
Yeah, so to be honest, I can't remember the numbers. I'd love to come back to the person that asked the question. So there is an interest around this in all categories, you could say, but of course, the closer you get to personal health, the more other things are important to you as a person. So these are categories where you need to think about how you do it in a different way, I think. But I would love to follow up on that question and look into the data.
Great. And that was from Yadira. Ken Gregory asks, so first of all, thanks you for the presentation, and said you offered that you felt that this will drive a much greater customer lifetime value. Do you have evidence that demonstrates how much greater? Also, correspondingly, with an attractive price point, is there evidence that points to the overall company performance for leader firms versus laggard firms or along the sustainability maturity curve?
Yes. So that was more than one question.
Yeah, that was a big question.
What was the first question again? Could you just repeat the first question?
It was about customer lifetime value. Do you have evidence that demonstrates how much greater?
Yes. So of course, a lot of companies measure customer lifetime value very differently. So I don't think we haven't seen, or we haven't done, you could say, industry-wide studies. We've seen it in our projects. So we've seen it with our clients, that clients that have managed to tap into sustainable consumer segments, we've seen that they have a higher lifetime value of those consumers. So they're more loyal, they switch less often, and we also see a higher degree of you could say advocacy. And all of that, of course, leads to a higher lifetime value based on the work I've done through my career. But I don't think there's industry-wide studies that show this. At least I haven't been able to find any, and we haven't conducted studies like that.
Okay. There are a few questions around geographic differences. So Andrea asks, have you studied differences in these insights across different geographical areas, example, US versus Europe? And Benson asks, in particular, in the global South, consumers are very price sensitive. Does your book cover some expectations from consumers in the global South?
Yeah, unfortunately, when we did the studies, we had to focus on North America and Europe because it was online studies we did over 3 years. And there's the data simply wasn't good enough if you looked at the developing world and South America and Africa. And the reason for that was you had higher income groups answering the questions, which is quite natural. And unfortunately, that skewed the results. So we decided to take that out. I think what's interesting, which might be interesting for the viewers, is that we actually debuked a lot of these common perceptions there are around geography and age. So first of all, we asked consumers, how much have you changed your purchasing behavior in the last 2 years based on becoming more sustainable? And the answer was the same, basically, from older generations to younger generations. So there was And we asked lots of other questions. So there were actually no proof that younger generations are more passionate or more driven or have changed their behavior more when it comes to sustainability, which was a very interesting finding. We didn't see a lot of difference on geography. We didn't see differences between countryside and big cities. So there was a lot of these demographic data points where we actually didn't see a lot of difference, at least not enough that it was interesting. So I think that's quite an important finding in the book as well. So I think it was much more interesting to look at those segments and the segmentation model, because that really was what made the difference in terms of how sustainable you were.
Great. I want to go back to the Darty example again, because and there's another question here about the apparel industry, but typically products that have longer lifespan tend to be more expensive. And so I had an appliance repair person tell me, don't even bother buying the more expensive products. Buy the cheap one. It's not gonna. None of them are gonna last you more than 5 years. Like this is crazy. So I guess the question is for companies that are trying to make that balance of affordability and quality and sustainability. What advice how would you advise a company in those sectors to do that? And that was from James.
Yeah, so I think it's a very good question. Of course, every company is unique. So that's why in the book, we also talk about you need to leverage your existing strategic capabilities and strengths as part of your sustainability strategy. So I think in durables, of course, I think this is a very, very interesting strategy, because wasteful products or products that you can't repair is a very easy way for consumers to say that's not sustainable. And consumers have never wanted design for failure. They have never wanted to buy a printer where there's a chip that cuts off after 10 or 100,000 prints, or an iPhone that gets slower with the software upgrade 4 or 5. And naturally, that's designed by failure. That's a strategy to make the products kind of unusable after a number of years. And I really believe that the consumer movement will be towards how long the products can last and the value in that. And there are many companies that we've looked into that to leverage this strategy. And of course, the natural thing is it's more high-end companies. We also interviewed a company like Bang & Olufsen. Of course, I know this is a very high-end speaker brand, but their big problem is that a lot of the technology moves faster than their design, so to speak. So the way they thought about sustainability and longevity is, let's detach technology from the design. So they launched a soundbar where you can exchange the television. And that creates a soundbar that lasts a very, very long time and is high design, and therefore also much more sustainable. And now you can exchange the TV, which is then not from Bang & Olufsen. But that's an example of applying existing strengths with this longevity play. So
there's Casey asked a question, are there any industries where consumers are having a hard time judging the validity of sustainability claims of products in the industry? For instance, plastics, recycling, and AI cloud services come to mind.
Yeah, and this is where companies need to be really careful, because as I said, as part of my presentation, consumers actually look a lot into this. So when they're choosing to become sustainable in a category, they will spend a lot of time and they will talk to a lot of friends and go online and look at reviews. And making bold claims, such as we've seen companies do around recycled plastic, when you're one of the major plastic polluters of the world, that is really dangerous, because consumers know that it doesn't matter if it's recycled plastic, it's still really poor for the environment. And that's why I say, if you talk about the fizzy drinks of the world or beer producers, it's not about electric trucks, it's not about the plastic bottles. If they really want to rethink this, maybe what they should do is find out a way where they're not shipping water from A to B. Maybe they should only ship the syrup and there's a dispenser at the private home. Naturally, that's a completely new business model. And there is a case in the book around SodaStream, but this is what I mean with really taking this head on and redesigning, rethinking your business model, because they will never solve the sustainability challenge by, reducing plastic waste a little bit.
Here's an interesting question from Bawana. interesting to see the various customer segments. What approach from corporations will influence to increase the percentage of consumers to be more champions and higher planet savers? Are there ways to approach skeptics to believe in the efforts the organizations are trying to approach?
Yes, we definitely believe so. Again, that was multiple questions, but
Yeah.
if you take the skeptics, so the skeptics are, as I said, they're not skeptical about the need for being more sustainable, but really, can I make a difference, and can I believe what companies are saying? So instead of making flashy messages, it's about bringing consumers on the journeys and saying, we know we can't be 100% sustainable tomorrow, but if you buy this product, it's X percent more sustainable than another product. You cannot communicate sustainability as a CO2 equivalent. Consumers don't know what their CO2 footprint are. So we need to make the communication simple, and relatable for consumers. And if you do that, and then of course these consumers will trust you more in terms of that journey. What we're also seeing in the last 3 years we've done the studies is consumers are moving to the right in the model. So once you've tried one sustainable category, you're willing to try another one. So consumers get more and more mature in terms of this.
Yeah, and a related question, Alex asks that it appears that marketing sustainable products ask for new marketing approaches, including innovative marketing models, probably enhanced by AI. Have you found any innovative model working already?
Unfortunately, we didn't dig into marketing as a topic in the book. Of course, we do a lot of that work as a consulting house. I think what I found, maybe it's not new innovative models, but it's really the shift from, you could say, flashy messages to more native-based marketing. So the whole thinking of saying consumers are willing to spend the time, so make sure your marketing matches that in the messages and the complexity, that the way you communicate. So I think that was the major finding as part of the surveys.
Yeah, and I love that you made that point at the beginning of your presentation, that sort of the broad general messages about sustainability, that people are sort of immune to that, and if you get specific about what it is and how it's working, that's going to be more effective.
Yeah.
There have been a number of questions, Nikolai, about how this applies to small organizations. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, of course, there's so being a small organization, there is both advantages and disadvantages, right? Normally, you're more agile. You're maybe, if you're family owned, I think there are some advantages that you have that a lot of the bigger companies don't have. Because when we're talking about sustainability, it's really, you could say it's almost sacrificing current profits for future profits. And that's very difficult when you're a stock listed company with quarterly results. But if you're PE owned or family owned with a longer perspective on ownership, there's actually a possibility to leverage this trend to take a very significant position in the market. If we take Patagonia, it's very difficult for any other outdoor company to challenge their position, because they basically branded themselves as the sustainable outdoor brand. And that's very, very difficult to copy. So I think if in terms of ownership structure, there are advantages. In terms of being, you could say, agile, there's advantages. Naturally, what's difficult is the cost associated with this in transition and how much you can do as a small company. But there, I would really think out of the box, because the big companies have that challenge, that they're very stuck in existing business model, existing structures, existing ecosystems. And as a small company, you can really rethink that. And I think the key to that is start with the consumer. And as I said before, a lot of industries are not actually, the business model is actually not catered to the consumer. It's based on historic development more than the actual needs of consumer. And if you can challenge that, I'm pretty sure you can be successful in this area.
So being able to make those kinds of shifts obviously is going to involve senior leadership and board members. So there are a couple of questions. Jason asks, what role do boards' oversight and executive compensation play in pushing leaders to act? But that assumes that there's somebody already at a very high level who's bought into this. And then Supod asks, curious to know, what does your book have for board directors to help in terms of corporate governance strategies? So I know those are two questions, but.
Yeah, I think our book is primarily focused on this consumer movement, what strategic consequences that has, and what strategic plays, as I presented, you can play. We have a last section that also talks about this ownership structure, but I think the board naturally has a super important role in this. And I think one of the roles is to really challenge the current sustainability strategy, because what we're seeing in a lot of companies, it's more a compliance strategy and a risk mitigation strategy than it's a market opportunity strategy. And what we're trying to do with this book is really challenge that situation. I mean, there was some research recently that shows that companies spend more on compliance than on innovating new green products. And of course, that is very scary. So boards and leadership, leaders and firms have a very important role to play in this. And I think that's as far as we get in the book.
Boy, this time has gone so quickly. I think we have time for one more question. And Alistair's asking, did you do any analysis on how much of a green premium consumers are willing to pay for sustainable products, in terms of just percentages, or is that, do you think about it in a different way?
No, so I mean, this is where so Simon Kucher as a firm is probably world renowned for doing pricing. So this is probably our core capability. So we do a lot of work around how to price products, everything from sport cars to medical devices and other things, clothing, other things. But what we saw in a lot of our research, so 10 years ago, as I said, it was about how do you monetize that smaller segment that are willing to pay a premium. What we're finding out now is a lot of companies and CEOs have developed green product lines and are saying, okay, help us monetize it. How do we commercialize it and what should it cost? And what we find out, of course, is that the premium is not as big as they thought. So it doesn't cover the added cost of these green products. And that's why you should always start in the other end and really understand consumers and what are the price points they're willing to pay, and then go back and say, how do we then develop a green solution that matches those price points? And that's really the way we do this with our clients today. I think this is really, really important. And this is not a new thing. This is a very typical mistake you do when you say want to take new products to market.
So I think for our last question, Chi is asking, so you talked about the ecosystem, and what if you're not the consumer product company, but you're in the trading and wholesale business, where they're, the kind of the middleman in the sustainability supply chain? Are there things that they can do to take steps?
Yeah. So again, it's always difficult to answer very specific questions about very specific industries. So wholesale is not my area of expertise, but I do think the Fnac Darty is a relevant case here, because a lot of the clients I have in retail have said the same thing. I'm a retailer. My footprint is very much to do with the products I sell. What can I do? How do I make a difference here? And they had a very, very interesting strategy to helping with making it easier for consumers to make this choice. So maybe as a wholesaler, you can do something similar. I don't know what the answer is. Interesting question, but yeah, I don't have an answer for that one.
Okay, well, Nikolai, we've gotten so many comments of just saying excellent presentation. Thank you so much, and I will add my thanks to that. Thank you for sharing this really different way of looking at the sustainable consumer market and how to tap into them. And I also want to thank the audience for asking such great questions and paying such close attention. So thank you so much, Nikolai.
Thank you, Abby.